Well, I don't think I'm alone in saying that it's difficult to know where to start when analysing the Rolex Australian Grand Prix. So many races within a race, so many nuances to this race. I don't know. Let's make it simple. The way Max Verstappen makes his racing simple, he was brilliant. He was outstanding. He made perfect starts from the pole 3 times, and he avoided first lap skirmishes 3 times, and he went on to win by managing the tyres, making only 1 or 2 errors. Everybody made errors in this race, and was just in total control. Even when George Russell seized the lead, and when Lewis Hamilton came down the inside and Max gave him room and made sure they didn't touch, well, if they did touch, it was only a brush. Even when the 2 Mercs are running 1-2, you could sense that Max was just sitting there waiting. The compound brilliance of that Red Bull RB19 manifests itself not only in grip and balance and drivability, but also in a top speed advantage. Lots of talk about how good it is with the DRS open. Well, with the DRS closed, it's just as significant, the top speed advantage that is. And that is what allowed him to manage the tyres perfectly. So first of all, George came in because his tyres were starting to overheat, and he switched to the hard tyre. Then, of course, the red flag came out. But prior to the red coming out, it was pretty clear that the only guy that might give Max any trouble was Lewis Hamilton, because he was doing a better job at that stage of managing the tyres, of keeping them cooler. But even he was no match for Max, of course. And yeah, just superb. I mean, I think Sergio Perez got driver of the day, probably because visually coming through the field, finishing where he did, not too bad. But what was he doing coming through the field? He should have been on the front row anyway. And just to clear up that point, I was talking in the qualifying video yesterday about Sergio saying there was something wrong with the car and they didn't fix it, the brake locking for qualifying, and it happened again in qualifying. And then the team in the same press release said, we will be checking the car over, and if there is anything wrong, we'll of course put it right. Emphasis on the word if, for sure. And so it proved. They changed the brake pads in Parc Fermé, but I spoke to a couple of the engineers and they both said absolutely nothing wrong with the car whatsoever. And so, Sergio, I think, incorrect in saying that to the press, but he is, that's how he is. And at the end of the day, there was nothing wrong with that car. It was a really, really good race car, and it should have started from the front row. And it should have been there as a bit of a cushion when Max had Lewis behind him at the restart, everybody on the soft red tyre. But he wasn't. He was there, and he was climbing through the field getting the Driver of the Day award, which I say, if you're going to give it to a Red Bull driver, give it to Max Verstappen. Why wasn't he Driver of the Day? I think would be a better question. So that was it. Max did a really, really good job. I just want to talk a little bit more about how well he did to avoid being hit by anybody at the first corner, and then by, when he was alongside Lewis going into the first right-hander, tight right-hander, and that's really good. That's Max Verstappen, 23 spec, very mature, very good at recovering from annoying situations, planning the race and doing the pass. And the pass was a typical Red Bull RB19 pass round the outside of Lewis Hamilton on a quick bit of Albert Park. Very, very impressive. Just showed the confidence and the sheer grip of that car. And he won the race, really well. His first win in the Australian Grand Prix, incredibly, but there you go. And Red Bull have not had a great record. Only had 1 win prior to this as well at Albert Park, incredibly. Jenson Button has won it 3 times, amazingly. Anyway, getting back to reality, Lewis Hamilton, I think the moment that George was in front of him, got the lead, and then Lewis got up to P2, you could see Lewis there thinking, right, the only way I'm going to beat George is just by looking after the tyres a little bit better than George. And obviously George had started to use the tyres quite a lot by then, just to do what he was doing with the car. And that's why he came in just before the red, and that's why Lewis was still out there when the red came on, because he was going to run longer, obviously, and that was potentially how he's going to beat George and be P2. We'll never know how it worked, and as we know, George eventually retired with, and this will be a worry, with a Mercedes power unit failure of some sort, fire out the back, looked like an oil fire, but who knows. And that is not good at this stage of the year. That will have an impact, obviously, in the usage of power units as they go into the vortex of the season. So that'll be a worry for Mercedes. And Lewis, so just on that point, if you're George Russell and you've led a Grand Prix, led the Australian Grand Prix from the start, great start down the inside, classic George Russell, and then you have the engine blow while you're leading, terrible thing. If the engine blows after you've had a sock in the teeth because you came in just before the red, and it's going to be difficult therefore to finish anything other than maybe third or fourth, it's not quite as bad. So there was that, but it wasn't great, obviously. And George, there was another weird part of George's race too, which is when he was rejoining after the red, and it was for as they're going behind the field or catching the field as they're going up to the standing start. He was going at the correct speed, catching up, and cars behind him were going at that speed. But then equally Lewis out on the track was going as slowly as possible, leading the field, as he's entitled to do. And there was quite a nasty moment. I think it was Yuki Tsunoda that had a big moment, nearly just came around a corner and found sort of 3 cars going at 3 miles an hour, and he was going, who knows, 80, 90 miles an hour. Not good. The stewards significantly said, this is not a good rule and we need to look at it. And they made a point of saying that. This needs to be changed. Anyway, we'll put that to one side. We'll park that because there's a little bit more that we need to be saying about that as we go on. So Lewis Hamilton, a very, very good second. He raced hard and well, and as much as you could say it was great that Mercedes finished second, I think the significant point is that they beat Aston Martin around Albert Park. Who would have thought that after the first 2 races that Mercedes would do that? Because Albert Park should have been an even better race for Aston Martin, because the one thing they're not particularly good at is top speed. They're not that quick through the air. And so Albert Park wouldn't have been too penalising for them, but yet Mercedes beat them. And I think a lot of that, not a lot, but certainly some of it, is that Mercedes are now quite quick, as I was saying in the video yesterday, quite quick in a straight line. And that's one thing the team have done really well over the winter. They've improved the speed through the air of that Mercedes, taken some downforce out of it quite clearly. And coming back to the obvious point, confusion at Mercedes. Do they stay with this car? Do they go with a new car? It wasn't bad. It's as quick as an Aston Martin, as of Albert Park. Let's see what happens as we go on. But Lewis made very good use of that top speed advantage. And we also saw, another point I made in the qualifying video, we also saw how difficult, relatively difficult it is now with the 23 rigs, the new floor rigs, to follow another car really closely, as Fernando Alonso found out. So even with the help of DRS, 3 DRS zones, even with that help, he wasn't able to do very much. And when he got within a second of Lewis, he had to sort of back away because the front went away on the car. And that, of course, would then eat into the tyre situation. So, yeah, a really good performance by Mercedes to beat Aston Martin. And that's a really significant point, I think, to take from this Australian Grand Prix. The next thing you got to say is that Ferrari were really good with Carlos Sainz. Now, they weren't really good with Charles Leclerc. He didn't do a great job in qualifying in terms of getting the tyres at the right temperature, didn't get in the lap, didn't get in the Charles Leclerc lap right at the end because he couldn't get him up to temperature. And that's not necessarily Charles' fault, but equally it is a look at the way the team's operating, and they didn't sort the car in terms of getting the tyres right the way, I don't know, Alpine did, or the way even Red Bull did, quite obviously. Charles Leclerc was then out on the first lap because he qualified further down than he should have. He was in the melee, in the traffic, trying to go for it. He's got 2 Aston Martins braking for the tight right-hander, and he goes to the left. He's got the momentum, he goes to the left, so he's effectively putting himself on the outside with 2 green Aston Martins inside him. What's going to happen? He's going to get taken out, and exactly that. I was really surprised that Charles did that because, well, I'm not surprised in a way, because I think he's getting quite emotional about the whole situation, the car not being competitive, getting beaten by Carlos Sainz in qualifying. And I think, he got the momentum, he got the run, he's there on the outside, and he's thinking, well, we'll just see what happens here. But we know what happens. We've seen Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso run into one another already, and there's no way Lance Stroll was going to back away and straight into him. And Charles was out. And just again, in the context of what I'm going to be talking about fairly soon, I think that was entirely Charles Leclerc's fault. There's no way he should have been putting that Ferrari on the outside going into that corner. He was too exposed to the potential rubbish that was going to happen, and it did happen. And that's in contrast with the way Max Verstappen handled the Lewis Hamilton pass in the same corner. But then there was Carlos Sainz doing an incredible job, building on the confidence he got from qualifying, from out-qualifying Charles, doing a really good job at the start. and running right up there. And that was, I think that if another driver would deserve driver of the day, it would be Carlos Sainz, because that Ferrari isn't that good a car. And he was certainly mixing it, showing the pace of Mercedes, Aston Martin. Really good, really, really good. Drove well and was running fourth towards the end of the race. Now we get to the other stuff that I want to talk about. He's running fourth towards the end of the race when, as we know, and it's been replayed a million times, Kevin Magnussen comes out of the first chicane and brushes the wall very lightly. But it's one of these things where you're shocked at the impact of that. And quite obviously it damages the rim, the air, it comes out of the right rear tyre, and he has a big moment, and there's lots of wheel rim debris down the circuit, bringing out the red flag, what was it, effectively 2 laps from the end of the race. And at this point, Carlos Sainz is a very, very good fourth behind Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, and Fernando Alonso. And then we know, as everybody knows, we go into a second restart behind from the red, and they're lining up on the grid for a proper standing start. And Carlos goes into turn 1 inside Fernando Alonso, who's ahead of him, but not necessarily on the racing line so far ahead that he can just use whatever bit of road he requires. He still needs Carlos Sainz to see him there and to back away and to give him the corner. Now, my point has been, ever since the Alex Albon, Lewis Hamilton penalty in Austria, whatever it was, 5 years ago now, that this rule is insanely stupid. If you're on the outside of any corner, as I've just said, Charles Leclerc with the 2 Astons inside him, you are tempting fate. You're totally in the hands of the cars inside you. And if they decide to use all the road and you have to take avoiding action, you have to take avoiding action and run into the boonies. You can't expect the driver on the inside of any corner to give way to you just because you're ahead, but you're on the outside. The guy on the inside owns the corner. That is the absolute golden rule of motor racing. But they've come up with this sporting code where now, if the car is ahead and he's on the outside, you have to give way to him. And I think that's completely wrong. And I've been saying that for 5 years. And that's why I say it was Charles Leclerc's fault. He shouldn't have put the Ferrari in that place of danger. And so there's Carlos Sainz on the inside. Fernando Alonso is now effectively doing what Charles Leclerc is doing. And inevitably, Carlos runs into him. I'm not saying there's anything malicious there at all. But of course, we have to add that, as I understand it, Carlos and Fernando have fallen out recently, and there's not a lot of love lost between them now. But that's not relevant, because I'm sure that wasn't going through the minds of either of them. They were just going focused, doing what they're doing. And okay, and this is where it gets complicated, but please bear with me, because I think these are important points to be made. Whether or not you agree with that rule, that if you're on the outside but ahead, you're entitled to the corner and the guy on the inside should back away and give it to you, whether or not you agree with that, and I don't, as I've just said, but if you do agree with that, you would agree then that Carlos Sainz should have got some sort of penalty. Now, this is where I think it went completely wrong in the Australian Grand Prix, because as we now know, that restart, that second restart, was effectively annulled, if that's the right word, because the 2 Alpines ran into one another coming out of the corner. Great shame for Alpine, because they had a really good race with Pierre Gasly and to some extent with Esteban Ocon recovering from bad qualifying. But Gasly had been right up there with Carlos Sainz as well. And quite early on in the race, I heard somebody in the PA saying, yeah, Gasly's holding up Carlos Sainz. Yeah, right. They were racing really closely. And Gasly, even when Carlos got him, Pierre stayed right with him. It was a really, really good race for him and for Alpine. And here also, I've got to say, another sub-clause that Pierre Gasly was actually quite fortunate when the first red came out, because he chose uniquely to start on a new set of softs, which he'd put aside because he only did that one run in qualifying in Q3, and they should have run 2. But he had that new set, and he put that on the car because he was determined to get past at least Alex Albon off the line, because the thinking was the Williams is super quick in a straight line, but it's probably going to hold us up a bit, so we need to get in front of him before the first corner. As it happened, that didn't work out. Pierre didn't make a great start with the soft tyre, and he was behind Alex Albon. And you thought, well, his race is gone now then, that's for sure. But then he didn't make the pit stop, and the red came out, and he was able to put on the hard and sort of reboot, and there he was, right up there with them. Anyway, the 2 Alpines crashed. And had those 2 cars not been damaged, they would have been allowed to restart as everybody else restarted. But because they were damaged and crashed, they were out of it. But the main point about that restart was that, And what happened then, when they finished behind the safety car, was that the first sector hadn't been reached, and therefore that first corner didn't really happen. It wasn't part of the race. And so therefore Fernando Alonso could come back and start in third place, and he was off in the boonies, and Lance Stroll, who was also off in the boonies, could come back and start wherever he was going to start, fifth or something. But guess what? They penalised Carlos Sainz 5 seconds. So effectively, they penalised him 5 seconds for an incident for part of the race that wasn't even part of the race. And that is completely wrong in my view. They rushed into it as well, because there's now an obsession after what happened in Saudi Arabia to get the penalty out and not discuss it after the race. So they rushed into it. And by giving him a 5-second penalty in what was then going to be just one parade lap behind the safety car, they were effectively saying, well, you're last now. You've gone from fourth to last, which is absolutely ridiculous. Why didn't they say 2-place grid penalty at the next race, or 3-place grid penalty? If they wanted to give him a penalty, why didn't they do that? Why for something like that, when he's on the inside anyway? Yeah, sure, Fernando's in front of him, but he's on the inside and he's made a good start. Why did they put him to the back of the field? Because of that. And that's effectively what happened. And I think that's completely wrong. And I think that's where I say, let's park this thing about this earlier on, talking about the speed at which you can drive when you're leading the field round to a standing start with the safety car. Lewis going perhaps too slowly, but he was legally allowed to do it. They need to look into that rule. They need to look into this rule as well. This is absolutely insane, I think. So Carlos Sainz effectively went from fourth to last, and if there'd been 18 cars restarting, it would have been 19th. Went from fourth to last for doing something that is a 5-second penalty, which normally wouldn't be that effective in a race anyway. It wouldn't have affected the race that much. And anyway, it was in an incident that wasn't even part of the race, because that was completely cancelled. Because Fernando Alonso was off in the boonies and so was Lance Stroll. None of that makes any sense to me, and I'm quite upset about that. Not because and there's a lot of people out there doing media or talking about Formula One do so under the heading of, well, I'm a Lewis fan, or I'm a Max fan, or I'm a Ferrari fan, or an Aston Martin fan, or a Fernando fan. I'm not doing this from a fan point of view. I'm doing this, and I think Charles Leclerc deserved to be in the boonies, to be honest, because I don't think he should have been down the outside. And I think there's no way in the world Carlos Sainz deserved to lose that fourth place, or even a points finish. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Why didn't? And I think, and I'm doing this in a rush after the race. I've got to get on the plane, but I think I'm correct in saying that when Lance Stroll took out Fernando Alonso in the US Grand Prix last year, just drove into him on the straight, his future teammate, when he did that, didn't he then get a grid penalty at the next race or something like that? I think he did. But so the precedent is there. For sure, when it comes actually to this business of, hitting somebody, causing an unavoidable accident or whatever it is, an avoidable accident, the protocol says it has to be a 5-second penalty or a 10-second penalty, and they didn't want to go beyond that, which to me is ludicrous, because we were going beyond the norm in so many respects in this race. And how often have we had a first corner shunt, and a first corner indeed, which has then been basically cancelled? It doesn't happen very often in Formula One. Once or twice, British Grand Prix 76. So, that's something that I think needs to be looked at. I think it's completely wrong that this penalty was just handed out to Sainz, and they were given no chance really to discuss it, and even to say, okay, mitigating circumstances, because it's effectively going to drop him to last place, give him a grid penalty in the next race. We'll accept that. That's what they should have done. And I think everybody would have agreed with that, because he drove really well. He didn't deserve to go to the back of the field for something like that, which is effectively a first corner accident anyway. I know the stewards have gone out of their way to say, well, it wasn't really a first corner because it was very clear this and that. But it was a first corner. Everybody was on relatively cold tyres, and everybody was going into the corner as late and as fast as they could, and they were racing. So yeah, I don't feel good about that. And then the other point I'd just like to make is that they then finished the race behind the safety car. Ring any bells? That's the finish we should have got at Abu Dhabi in 2021. I didn't see any Australian fans, and they're pretty vociferous at the best of times. I didn't see any Australian fans complaining or booing, saying, no, we want this race to finish as a proper one-lap race. This is terrible. They were all cheering and clapping exactly as I said they would have in Abu Dhabi 21 if they'd finished it behind the safety car, as they should have done, and Lewis had been cruising around to win his 8th world title. And that to me was absolute proof again of what went wrong at Abu Dhabi, and I still feel very hot under the collar about that as well. I still think it's that they completely blew that, and Lewis Hamilton was robbed of that 8th title in that one incident. Of course, you don't win or lose a championship in one race. All I'm talking about is the decision that was taken, and nobody cared at all. The Australians just loved that safety car last lap. They're all cheering, and I thought actually a couple of the drivers might wave to the crowd because it wasn't as if you could overtake it or anything, but they didn't. But nonetheless, it was nice. They came around slowly, and everybody stood and cheered and clapped, and it was a great moment, just as it would have been at Abu Dhabi in 21. So I thought that was an interesting contrast. A few other things. Alex Albon's shunt. He says that in the previous corner he ran wide, spiked the tyre temperatures. And it's interesting. I've never seen. I don't know about spikes and tyre temperatures. Ran wide and spiked the tyre temperatures. Why? Going over the curb, maybe. Anyway, and then because the tyres were hot, he just lost the back end. And he said he was actually going slower through there than he normally would. So, to my eye, and I have to say, didn't have access to the full replays that I normally have because I was doing other stuff at the Grand Prix, this Grand Prix. And as I say, I'm a bit of a rush anyway. But to my eye, the onboard from the car following, I wish I could remember who it was now, might have been Hulkenberg, I think shows that his DRS is open as he goes into that right-hander. Of course, when the car comes to rest and half the rear wing end plate's off, you can't tell. The DRS is broken, probably. But I think it's open there, and he lost downforce. And I think it's part of this DRS drama that I've been talking about. That's one thing I wanted to say about that. Let me just have a look through the other results as well. I know this is being a little bit casual, this one, but it's the right way to do it, I think, because it's a race that's got so many aspects to it. The only way is just to sort of take highlighted incidents and talk about them. So we talked about Gasly. Lance Stroll, wasn't really there all day, was he? But he just got this amazing bonus towards the end, so good luck to him. Sergio Perez, driver of the day. Yeah, right. But yeah, Lando Norris, fabulous, really, really good. Never gave up, looked clean and efficient and drove a bad car really well. McLaren really slow in a straight line. And Oscar Piastri similarly drove really well, I thought. Both of them, excellent performance. Great to have both McLarens in the points for McLaren fans, but yeah, great anyway. I mean, they've had a terrible start to the year, so that's a nice fillip for them. I'm not sure James Key will be feeling too good about it. I feel a bit sorry for him, but anyway, there you go. Nico Hulkenberg, I thought, drove superbly, absolutely superbly. He stopped, didn't he, right at the end? But what a drive! We know Kevin Magnussen's pretty good, but he just overshadowed him all day, and Nico was outstanding. I mean, what would Nico do in the second Red Bull as a wingman for Max Verstappen? I mean, talk about the perfect driver. Got to add him to the list, with Valtteri Bottas and potentially Carlos Sainz, certainly Sergio Perez. And just actually a point, I know this is all over the place, to go back to the Sergio thing and, him making the excuse about there's something wrong with the car when quite clearly it was the braking that I detailed in the video yesterday. I think in reality, Red Bull were actually quite relieved that had happened because, as I said, he came from Saudi Arabia as the winner of the race, and I didn't see it because I didn't see it in the media, but apparently he'd been saying things like, "Oh yeah, I'm in it for, I can win this championship," and sort of, "Whoa, hang on, Sergio, just take it cool, mate. You are number 2 to Max Verstappen, basically." And I think this was like a reality check of, okay, now you know that you're not Max Verstappen. I think there's a little bit of that, and there's a little bit of relief, I think, at Red Bull with that, because what they never need, and they're so good at this, is that sort of ridiculous additional pressure on Max. The sort of pressure that Piastri puts on Lando Norris just by being super quick. The sort of pressure that George Russell, of course, puts on Lewis Hamilton just by being super quick. So, yeah, and Red Bull very wary of that. And in a way, I think that sort of dampened that down a bit. So I got the feeling that they weren't that annoyed about the whole thing. Fernando drove really well. But again, just to reiterate, interesting that he got beaten by Lewis Hamilton in a Mercedes today. And I put a lot of that down to the difference in top speed between the Aston and the Merc. And yes, obviously some cars are going to be affected by the new turbulence more than others, but quite clearly Fernando was, and couldn't get within a second of Lewis, as I say. Anyway, that's it. I'm a bit wound up, as you can tell. I'm going to go and pack now and get on the flight, and see you soon.